Welcome to Second Look Education. I'm Amy.
And I'm Candace.
We're educators examining what's really happening in classrooms, policy, and teacher preparation. When joy is treated as optional, when professional judgment is replaced by scripts, and when compliance is mistaken for quality, both teachers and children pay the cost.
This podcast is our refusal to normalize that. Are we educating for compliance or for a future of educated critical thinkers?
That question drives everything we do. Each episode starts with a real moment from education, something observed, experienced, or encountered that made us pause and ask, what's actually going on here?
We dig into the complexity, we reject false binaries, and we refuse to pretend that what we're seeing is sustainable. This is Second Look Education.
Welcome back to Second Look Education Podcast. Today we're taking a second look in a two-parter with Amy.
Well, I'm really excited about this one. Really excited. Okay, so the moment that I want to talk about today is, it's been in the news. The LA Unified School Board came up with this resolution directing the school district about screen use. I've been thinking about screen use and how I wanted to bring it to our conversations here, and this was like the perfect opportunity. So this screen time policy that the school board has come up with is looking at instructional technology in the classroom, but it moves beyond phones. So that's been a lot of the conversation across the country, right, is getting phones out of school or what kids are doing with phones in schools. But this is different because this is actually talking about the screens that the school district themselves gave the kids. Some of the things that this resolution brings up that I'm going to talk about are like putting limits on like time per grade level. One of the biggest things that as an early childhood practitioner like really excites me is that they're eliminating one-to-one devices for first grade and under.
That's amazing.
They are recommending that for grades 3 through 5, they have cart rules.
Back to the cart, yeah.
Talking about this, we used to have carts of Chromebooks or laptops or iPads or whatever. They're putting restrictions on how kids use those devices during lunch and recess and passing periods, particularly up through middle school. And advocates are pushing for more in high school as well, because I kind of tend to forget about those high schoolers, right? Yeah. Especially when it comes to devices.
Yes.
They're going to expand paper, pencil, and textbooks and authentic materials in the classroom. They'll have clear options for parents to opt in and out of technology use. And they're looking at...
amazing.
I know, right? And they're looking at this formal review of everything that they use. So what platforms they're using, including things like instructional value, the time that they're putting in, how much money they're spending on these things. And that's what makes this a big deal, because we're not just looking at like the phones that kids bring into school, but we're also looking at how they're using these screens in schools and what this means. It's big. And so they're bringing in things like student mental health and well-being and data privacy, the role of AI and digital tools. The policy has to be put in place by June next month to be implemented next school year. So we're going to see a big turnaround of this school district. Yeah. So I thought this was worth a second look, right? And the implications for other school districts to follow suit are huge. And my mom, when she found out I was doing this, sent me a newspaper clipping. It's the only ones who still get the newspaper. But anyway, they're not the only school district is what I want to get at. LA is not the only one. They're just the biggest one right now. So there's schools in like Kansas and North Carolina, Virginia, Maryland that are doing this, that they've moved beyond phones and they're saying, you know what? We took the phones out, but guess what? We're still having problems, right? And so now we need to look at how we're using screens in a bigger capacity. And so we're in Illinois. And so I was looking into like, do we have any policy? Because I know the school district that my children attend, there's a phone policy about like putting it in your backpack. It's got to be out of sight, that kind of thing. But there isn't a formal policy in the state. And so there's actually a Senate bill right now going through that focuses on prohibiting student using wireless devices in schools. So that would be a first step for Illinois. And then once, it's for us, it's still based on the phones, but it's like once these phones got out of schools, we're still having problems. So now we need to address those. And that's what this is really looking at. And so I kind of wanted to look at this because, again, it's bigger than just our kids on screens. It's looking at the infrastructure that was built around these screens and really decomposing that, right? Breaking it down. Like, what did we do here and how do we need to address it?
Yeah, I think it's interesting too, because that we did build an entire system and structure around devices and technology, and there was a time where it was needed.
Yeah.
But now it's common practice. And, I was even thinking about the whole cell phone policy. I mean, so students typically bring in burners and they'll put them wherever they're supposed to go, and then they keep their other phone with them. And I know we're going to get into this a little bit more, but like, are phones the issue, or is it that we are just nonstop on technology? I think in high school we had cell phones and I started with a pager, but like it was a lot harder to sneak, but you didn't have constant access,
Right.
it wasn't like internet
And you didn't
enabled.
feel like you were entitled to constant
yes,
access. Right.
yes,
Right. We've made it ubiquitous. And just because something is everywhere doesn't mean we have to use it everywhere.
yes.
But yeah, so for for the longest time, we had to get technology into classroom. It was progress. More access meant more opportunity, and more opportunity means equity. But again, this policy kind of interrupts that, and that's what I really like about it. A bigger issue is kind of like we spent so much time getting devices into classrooms and in students' hands that we didn't set up the guardrails that are necessary to make sure that it's worthwhile and everything and protective, but also more importantly, like, is it educationally sound? Like
Well,
should
and
be.
figuring it out as we go, right? So, and with something that can be dangerous, I can just think back to some of my own early experiences trying to incorporate technology, and then students would figure out ways behind the protections that we had in place and caught a few things that I wish they didn't have access to. But you're right, the guardrails and like what it should look like in the classroom versus is it just an everyday part? Are students engaging with it, or is it just something you're using? And where do we lose sight of those other things? And so I really like the thought of those guardrails needing to have been in place before we do anything. And now we're backing up and we're saying, okay, we need to have parameters and decide what this should look like and what it shouldn't and where it belongs and where it doesn't.
Yeah. So that first thing about access is I think we have partially confused access with like instruction and learning, right? Just because we have this tool doesn't mean we need to use it for everything. And we need to be very critical about how it's being used in our classrooms, what it's replacing, what kind of learning can be accessed through this, or should we be using this for, whatever content or concept or skill that we're working on. Because devices do have purpose. They can help us with communication, or when you think of students who need supports or accommodations or even remediation, there are some programs that do have some benefit. We're talking like rote skill practice and things like that. But just because we have them doesn't mean we have to use them for everything.
I mean, I know a school that took out classroom libraries.
Wow.
And I'm talking early years. And they don't have classroom libraries and everything is iPad. And so we've had a few student teachers at this district, and they're like, you're always talking about like using an actual book and all these things, but they don't even have classroom libraries. Everything the students do, worksheets, activities, books, everything is on that iPad. And they were like in those early years, and I just find that
it's hugely problematic for how children learn, especially
and devastating. I mean, it's devastating. Like the idea of holding a book, that's even a skill we teach in those early years, like how you read,
hold a book
and how you read. Yeah.
Yeah. Something that I appreciate about this LA resolution is they talked about like how screens are being used. Like, is it being used for creativity or for research or for passive viewing, for gaming, for using an instructional application? They're actually looking at how kids are using them, which moves again beyond just screen time, which is kind of where all of the guidance about using screens it kind of wraps itself around, right? It's like how much screen time is too much for an 8-year-old versus a 12-year-old. But when really these deeper questions about how it's being used, what it's being used for, and what it's replacing are much more important.
I mean, that's also important because how often is it, oh, when you're done, you can go on your, Chromebook, iPad, whatever.
Yeah.
Or, we've had experiences observing where the teacher during their observation is using the device in place of their instruction.
Yeah.
And that's not the time. I'm here observing and not understanding those concepts, which just again goes to tell us that we have an issue there that isn't understood.
Yeah. And, that's something for us as teacher educators to be making sure we're mindful of in our, classes and how we support our pre-service teachers in approaching technology in the classroom. That it's not just because we have them, we should all be using them. Equity also means like you need equitable opportunities to work with manipulatives and touch textbooks and developmentally appropriate practice, right?
Yeah.
So the other thing is that when children are on devices, their attention can look like they're being very attentive. If they're quiet, that's what you mentioned, right? The kids are quiet and they're on their Chromebooks, they're clicking, their headphones are on, they're looking at the screen. It can look like they're doing something, right? Something productive. It can look like learning, but clicking isn't learning. And we also know that the things that program developers put into these programs to keep kids there, right? To keep them engaged and interested and clicking and moving, are the very things that like interrupt learning. Like we just talked about in our last episode, like we need depth, we need time to process and think about things. And when kids are, they can answer the question or they can move the word into the blank or, click the number in the bubble the fastest, they're not having that depth of understanding at all. And so, devices shift attention. So I was recently reading about screens in schools, and one of the quotes that stuck out to me when I was thinking about attention and how kids are using devices in schools is like, when using a laptop in class, students spend 24 to 38 minutes of every hour off task. I mean, when you think about it yourself, and so then I was reflecting on my own when I'm sitting down working, how often if I am not consciously checking myself to say, this is where I'm at, this is where I'm putting my attention, I will click to check my email. I will click to see if anybody submitted an assignment for me to review.
You bounce around.
Yeah. And so, and we know that shifts our attention. When we're multitasking, our brains can't actually.
Well, or ads or notifications pop up or any of that shifts your learning. And, again, I go back to like middle school and high school, they would shut off certain ways for the students to communicate with each other, but the students were still finding ways. So even if they're not on their cell phone, they're engaging through those devices. There's a lot of things happening through those devices. And so you can't prevent all of that. So in those in themselves, or, there's a lot of games blocked, and there's certain ones that you can't block because they're connected to certain programs. So they're still doing this. And then what were you doing this whole time? Well, I got caught in this game I was playing and forgot to do my assignment, But then again, like, what is the relevance of that assignment if they're not engaged with it anyway?
Yeah.
And how we've made it so easy to have those moments of distraction.
Right. That multitasking, or even, as I'm learning more about how kids engage with screens versus learning in traditional methodologically sound teaching practices. Like we know how kids learn, and so we have developed teaching methods to support that. And how when we give kids a screen and it looks like they're learning or they're attentive, but they actually can't process this on this two-dimensional device and then transfer it into their three-dimensional world. That's why it's so important that, when we're counting with little kids, that we give them things to count, that they learn that this is 1 and this is 2, right? And so they can count the beads on the screen, but then they might not be able to do that in real life, because there's an additive transfer to that when they take it off the screen and then try and do that in real life. That's why, I was just reading about Duolingo, how it's real bells and whistles, and you get through all these levels, and you're learning the language. But most people who go through this program, they can't actually speak the language.
That's funny, because I was actually, when you started talking, I was thinking about Duolingo. I use it. And the other day, my husband said to me, "Are you really learning? Because you go through those really fast." And I was like, I think I am, because I'm getting a lot of answers correct. but I don't think I'm ready to talk. Now, I can't say anything about their like paid program because I'm
Sure.
not paying for it, but I'm using it. I'm like a stepping stone, and then I'll take a class,
Yeah.
to learn the language better. It was just a starting point for me. But yes, bells and whistles and celebrations and all those things. But no, I don't think I could go
Right.
out and start speaking it. There's a
Right.
few things that stand out, but that in depth and like being able to be conversational, no,
Yeah,
no.
yeah, because you're not having that depth of understanding in real world context, right?
Yes.
And so that's why it's so important that we give kids books, that we give kids manipulatives, that they work in real world context before they go into that virtual space, because they can do it in the virtual space if they have the foundation in,
Yes.
the real world, so they don't have that transfer deficit really coming from the screen to the real world. The other thing, that is that once screens are in our schools, or once we have the one-to-one devices, they change the environment. We kind of have kind of touched on is like we start learning through them more often.
Mm-hmm.
And so it crowds out a lot of things. Like we mentioned, the
Mm-hmm.
paper, the pencil, the manipulatives. It crowds out conversations,
Mm-hmm.
which is really important to learning, is being able to talk about what you're learning.
Well, even teachers writing on a board.
Yeah.
They make all the slides now, but there's something to be said for the teacher demonstrating. And yes, I get it. It can show one thing at a time, but there's something to be said for the teacher working through and processing and then individualizing within there as well.
Yeah, think aloud is a very profound teaching
Yeah.
strategy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talking through and demonstrating, like you mentioned, how to do this thing
Mm-hmm.
is really important, and that can't happen from click, 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 click,
Yeah.
click. But yeah, a lot of things lose space when we invite these screens into our classrooms. Not only just materials and conversations, but play loses space, movement loses space. Something that comes up a lot when you're reading about teachers' experiences with screens, and I guess it never was that bad when I was still in a classroom. Like I was never in where we were exclusively using devices, but it's disheartening to hear about how teachers, like, all they're doing is staring at the backs of their students' heads and watching them click and waiting for a time to jump in and talk. And so even that observation, that is so important to teaching. Like I mentioned before, the empathy part of teaching, where we can feel how our students are processing,
Mm-hmm.
that's deeply personal, and it's eliminated when the screens are there. I'm not looking
Yeah.
you in the eye,
Right.
or even observing you. I'm watching you click through something, or most of the time kids have headphones
Yes.
on even, which,
But and in the least judgmental way possible, as a former administrator, who would pop into classrooms, how many of the teachers are walking around even when they are? Because and this isn't a judgment thing. It's you're like, oh, they're working on their devices for 20 minutes. I've got 20 minutes to catch up
for
on
sure.
something. It's missed moments. We say that there's not enough time in the day, but like, where is our time being spent? And I think I'm gonna make this general statement, at least for the teachers who have been in the profession for a long time. I think they miss not having technology in the classroom. I know for myself, even in higher education, working with our teachers, I have to like sometimes be like, can you guys all put your devices away? Let's take out a notebook. I tell them like in our class, we're going to use a notebook. And it's like, they pause and like look at you and no, because I want you engaging. I want you talking. And even if you're on my slideshow on the device and you're meaning to pay attention, all these notifications, you mentioned the interruptions, and there is research around the fact that every time you feel your phone go off, you've lost track of something. You can't concentrate. We can multitask, but it doesn't mean we're multitasking in terms of doing multiple things at once. It means we're jumping from thing to thing.
Yes.
And so that doesn't allow for that like in depth, a while back you gave me that time blocking, and one of the things that was suggested on it is when I'm writing or doing research or something that I need a device for, shutting off my Wi-Fi. And so shutting off the Wi-Fi on the device, putting my phone on do not disturb, and what a difference that makes. And I like X out of my email, so I'm actually engaged in that task, and you forget how it's almost like uncomfortable to not be getting notifications, because we've become so used to it.
Yeah.
The interruptions.
And when you give yourself the opportunity to have those distractions, right, when they are available, then you have this literal craving for it. Like, oh, what was that? Or even, there's studies about, like, even when kids have their phones with them at school, but even when they're in their backpacks, like, they can't access them, there's still like this gnawing feeling at them that they want to get to it. They want to get to the passing period.
Let's
so
see
they can
what
get out there
happened.
and
Yeah.
see. Yeah. So we come back to this learning environment piece that the LA resolution came up with. Is they're talking about all of these beautiful things about, like, screen usage in schools and grade levels and who should have these one-to-one devices, but they're also looking at what did bringing these devices, making them the default, what did that crowd out, and how can we bring in more authentic materials, more meaningful ways for kids to process and engage with the content
And each other. Because when they're on these devices, they're not engaging with each other. They're not having those conversations. We keep coming back to, like, the social changes in students, but they're not having those moments to work on those factors of working with others, being conversational, going through difficult conversations at any age. None of those opportunities are happening. And again, I'm generalizing because I know they're happening in some spaces, but for a lot of spaces, when it's high technological use, those are limited because you're on your device, and engaging on your device is not the same thing.
It isn't.
It is not. And having to take those pauses and hearing and listening, it's a different situation.
Yeah, and it's a good thing to practice, right? And that's what I keep coming back to. Like, yes, screens are everywhere, and I'm not anti-tech, that. I'm not anti-screens even, but I am anti, like, in our schools. I want schools to be this sanctuary, this space where technology isn't infiltrating every aspect of it. There's a difference between learning about technology, which is important. Yes, kids need to learn how to type and how to work a computer and how to especially protect themselves in these spaces, but we don't need to learn through them. And we've come to this place where we're learning.
Well, and I think back to, I always tell our students, it wasn't until third grade that computers showed up in schools for me. And it was that big, huge computer, and everybody had to go to the lab, and you didn't even have enough. You had to take turns, and usually it was like Oregon Trail or the typing programs, right? Because we had to learn how to type. But then we did have that transition, and then it became more and more. And then we had the rolling smart boards in the classrooms. It became more and more. And now we're at a stage where I don't even think we need to necessarily teach technology unless we're using it for students to engage with for learning tools. Like we talked about, those parameters. They know how to use it better than the teachers do, essentially, because it's a part of their everyday lives. So if that's a part of their everyday lives, we need to scale back and talk to the parts that aren't. So the students that maybe aren't using a library at home, or the students that aren't writing when they're at home, or engaging critically. And then that information they're taking in, they can push back and ask themselves, am I just digesting this information, or am I putting information out there?
Yeah. So part of the problem, that makes the school board decision so important is that, we wanted technology in schools, and we scaled much faster before we had these consistent limits, the clear reporting, before families really understood, that they could consent to technology use or privacy use, right? Data privacy, which are really important. And we're seeing it a lot more now. So it seems like a lot of schools and districts have built their school days around technology without clearly not only setting limits, but really understanding the impact that technology is having. And so this policy is kind of catching up to the infrastructure, which I think is really important. It's sad that we didn't put this in place first. But it's really important that a big school district like this is taking the time to say, you know what, we messed up. And it's important for kids to know that too. Like, we've messed up. And so now we need to take a step back and really look at this from all angles and see how we need to improve it. And that's the steps that they're taking are very commendable, in my opinion.
Yes. I know a lot of parents who are going to be happy. And I think even some students, they do. sometimes we want what we want, but we don't know what we need. And I think that difference is going to make a huge difference. As you're saying all that, I'm thinking about the fact that I have a friend who has two older children and then a younger child who was starting kindergarten. And she selected a school. She happened to pick a Catholic school because she assumed there'd be less technology. So she's really excited because she is not liking the technology in the schools. And so I think it was first grade that her daughter came home. She's like, Mom, you're not going to like this. We got our iPads. And the friend of mine was like, oh no. She was really upset because that was part of the reason she chose the school she did. And so I think we're seeing an overwhelming amount of parents that are like, this is too much. They're trying to do what they can at home. It's embedded in everything we do, but then in schools, they understand that there's too much, and then we don't even know what they're doing, and we're submitting things digitally, and there's the concepts they're not saying their students get quite as more in depth. So I think there's pushback all over the place.
There is. Yeah.
And so it's nice to see such a huge district. And, I think I've mentioned too before, Finland took a step back too.
Yeah.
They said this is not working. Screens are not working in schools. And we're talking about a place that does extremely well. And they said, no, this is doing more harm than good.
Yeah. Yeah. For the long, we were sold on it, right? Technology is advancement, right? We were sold on this. It's more efficient. It's your kids are going to be more engaged, right? And we were like, okay, all right,
Yeah.
we're on board, right? And now we're taking a step back.
Yeah.
So I always like to do this. What do we do with this information kind of for parents and teachers? And so as I was thinking about this, I think it's really hard, like you kind of mentioned, for parents. It's something unsettling, right? There's something unsettling about this. And so the first step, looking at this policy that this school board came up with, made me dig into our school district's policy. So just starting with asking these questions and knowing what your kids are going through, what the policies are around phones or screen use in school, and then talking to your kids, like, what are you experiencing?
Yes.
What are you experiencing in school? What kind of attention is being asked from them in school? Like if your kid's on a screen all day at school, they probably don't need more content from a screen when they get home.
Right.
So looking at that from that perspective is, we already know kids have a hard time when they come home from school. There's that decompression period.
Yes.
When they come home from school. And so to be really conscious of this, the last thing they probably need is a device in their hands, but that's a personal decision.
Yes.
I'm not going to make that for anybody, but talking to your kids and thinking about like what they experience at school, what they might need more of at home. It's probably something more like a conversation or movement or connection.
Yes.
Right. And there's a lot of protective factors that we can kind of put in place. The screen aware literature has a lot of these, but having responsive relationships protects against screen harms, and going outside, it protects things like having access to resources. But for children, I think it's a lot more about like having more opportunities for free play and physical activity to kind of mitigate these harms, because we know they're going to be on screens. So what do we do to protect them both in those spaces, but outside of those spaces? And so then thinking about for teachers, I think it's a lot about, again, what is the policy? What does the school say? Knowing what the policies are in schools and where you're teaching, what exactly is required and what isn't required. And then thinking about the conversation that we just had, like where is attention being affected for children? How is the learning environment changed, when you have to use these screens or when you do use them? And try to protect those spaces from crowding out everything that is meaningful and appropriate for your students. One of we're going to move into in our next episode, which is really exciting for me, this like all of this, how it came to be, and we'll get a lot more in depth about all of that. But for now, kind of thinking about that digital doesn't automatically mean an upgrade. And I think that's where this LA conversation comes from. For the longest time, we thought it was. Technology is advancement, and getting technology in everyone's hands is an equitable thing to do. But that isn't always the case. And sometimes it's really important for us to take a second look at that.
So school screens didn't become normal by accident. They were adopted, funded, marketed, scaled, and slowly folded into the idea of what modern learning looks like. So thank you for taking a second look at this topic with us that we're going to be bridging into the next episode where we ask, how did this become our default in the first place? Thank you for joining us.
See you next time.